Well, welcome everybody to our keynote speaker event. Starting at 7 o'clock, we had a couple things early just as people are starting to sign on. Shona, do you want to explain what we see on the screen?
Sure. As people have been mentioning where they're from, I've been plopping them down on this map here. It's a Google map. Some of them, they just have the state, but many are by the city. And so if people want to, they can drop in the chat where they're from or click on the map link and feel welcome to put themselves on there just as a way to see. So far, there are 11 states represented here all across the country, which is pretty exciting. Just leave this up for another second or two as people are joining us. I always think that's pretty amazing to see how far people are able to easily zoom in. Ooh, more places. I'm going to go add them to the map. It's exciting to add more places to the map. How fun. So people who are just attending are joining now. We are just adding to a little map that shows where people are coming from for this festival all across the country, including Hawaii. This is over the course of the weekend. I'm offering tech support from Redwood Rocks Dance Studio in Arcata, and the Arcata Playhouse has a live streaming jazz concert tonight. So if you hear drumming and music in the background, it's from that.
How exciting. I was thinking it was some kind of grouse or something we were hearing drumming back here.
It's not birds, it's musicians, real life musicians.
All right, and lastly, I just want to add a poll question. Just about your birding experience. So can you see the poll question there? How many years have you been calling yourself a birder? Doesn't mean all the years you've been birding or been seeing birds, but go ahead and answer that. And also the last two questions you can answer as many, so you can also answer the last two. I use eBird or I don't use eBird. We will not be using any of this information collected to sell you any kind of services.
I like that disclaimer.
Okay, well, a couple more seconds. Okay, so let me end the polling and share the results for those who are curious. Gives you an idea of our attendance. So pretty good. So 37% use eBird, 26 do not, and many have more than 25 years. So welcome everybody, no matter what your skills are. So it is 7 o'clock. I'm going to turn this over to Rob Fowler to introduce our tonight's speaker. How exciting.
Hey, thanks, Bob. And welcome, Nathan. And looks like you are coming from what you just told me, Carthage, Texas, near the Louisiana border. And you're down there with a bunch of Cornell folks and such, and enjoying some spring migration there and enjoying some fallouts down there. So thanks for taking the time and setting some time aside to come give us a wonderful talk about bird sounds. And I'll just introduce you here a little bit. Nathan Pieplow is the author of Peterson Field Guide to Bird Sounds, published in 2 volumes, Eastern, which was published in 2017, and Western in 2019. He's an avid bird sound recordist and videographer. He's the author of the bird sound blog, earbirding.com, a board member of the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, an author of the Colorado Birding Trail, and former editor of the journal Colorado Birds. He teaches writing and rhetoric at the University of Colorado. And based on my own experiences with Nathan, I've seen him do some amazing sound quizzes for Western Field Ornithologist conferences a couple of times. And I can assure you that this will be an engaging talk. And I'm sure he's going to play some, I imagine he's going to play some bird sounds that you'll have no idea what kind of bird they're coming from. Yeah. He always pulls out a wild card somehow. So it should be really amazing and engaging, and no pressure, Nathan, no pressure whatsoever. But welcome, and thanks for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much, Rob, and thank you to everybody. It is a great pleasure to be here. I am, as Rob said, normally based in Colorado, but I have come down to the Texas coast to spend some time down here this spring. I've never been able to be here in the spring before, and since I'm teaching remotely because of the pandemic, I'm able to take advantage of that. So tonight, I want to talk to you about what birds are saying to one another. I imagine you can see my title screen here, The Language of Birds, and we've got that common yellowthroat serenading us. Up at the top of that slide, you see this black kind of sharp squiggle above my name. That is actually the yellowthroat's song. That is a picture of its song. That is what we call a spectrogram. A spectrogram is a computer-generated graph of a sound. And sometimes people ask me, how can you write a field guide to bird sounds? Well, this is how. The field guide actually pictures all of the sounds using spectrograms. And with practice, you can learn how to read them. You can learn how to translate what you're seeing there into sounds in your head. Or when you're listening to a sound, you can picture what it would look like on the spectrogram. That's not what we're going to be focused on tonight, but I just wanted to let you know what that is, because at certain times during tonight's presentation, you might see some black squiggles appear on the screen when a bird is singing. When you see that, that's what this is. It is the spectrogram of the bird's sound. And there we go. I like to say that all around us, all the time, the birds are always telling us who they are and what they're doing. For example, that bird just told you that it's a Redwing Blackbird. It also just told you that it's a male. It also told you a few other things, but we'll get to those in a minute. That bird also just told you that it was a Redwing Blackbird. It told you that it was a female, and it told you a few other things that we'll get to in a minute. If the birds are always telling us who they are and what they're doing, the problem is a lot of times we don't speak bird. We can't understand them, but we can learn. There's a species I saw quite a few of today. That's a cliff swallow. And if you are familiar with cliff swallows, you know that they nest in large colonies underneath bridges and in culverts. If you walk up to the cliff swallow colony, if you walk under the bridge, for example, all the cliff swallows in the colony will fly out from their nests and they will circle over your head, making this sound. because that ziu call is the word in cliff swallow language that means danger. But cliff swallows have some other words in their language as well, like this one. That sound is a sound that cliff swallows only make on cool, cloudy days. On cool, cloudy days, it becomes difficult to be a cliff swallow because cliff swallows eat swarms of flying insects. And on cool, cloudy days, when it's rainy or misty and foggy, the insects don't like to fly very much. So what happens on those days is that all the cliff swallows spread out from the colony in different directions, hoping that one of them will get lucky and actually come upon a swarm of insects that is actually flying despite the weather. If it gets lucky and finds a swarm of flying insects on a cool, cloudy day, it makes this sound, and that immediately recruits all the other cliff swallows from the colony within earshot to come as quickly as they can and take advantage of that swarm of flying insects while it is still flying. Now, it's possible that other species of swallows also have food finding calls like the cliff swallow does, but if they do, we don't know about it. And in fact, the only reason we know what that call means in cliff swallow language is because there's been one ornithologist who's been returning and studying the same colony of cliff swallows in Nebraska for 25 straight years. And they discovered this call somewhere around like year 15 or something like that. It takes a tremendous amount of work and research and field work in order to figure out what the birds are actually saying to one another. And the fact is that very, very, very few bird species have been well enough studied that we actually know what they are saying to one another. That's actually one of the things I love most about bird sounds. I love that whenever you are studying bird sounds, you are standing very close to the frontier of human knowledge. I like to tell people that it is far easier to go into your backyard and record a bird sound that's never been recorded before than it is to go out anywhere with your camera and take a photograph of a bird that hasn't been taken before. So I would encourage you, and we will talk a little bit more about this later in the talk tonight, I would encourage you to record bird sounds when you go out, even if you're just doing it on your phone, because there are a tremendous number of cool things that we could do if we had more recordings of bird sounds from all throughout these birds' ranges. And if you really want to get into it and start doing some research, you could actually contribute to our knowledge about bird sounds, possibly even from your own backyard or your own hometown. So tonight we're going to talk about what birds are actually saying to one another. And we're going to come back, for starters, to this pair of Redwing Blackbirds that we heard from earlier. In fact, we're going to come back to this pair of Redwing Blackbirds a few times tonight. One of the reasons is because Redwing Blackbird is one of those few species of birds that actually has been really well studied. So we have a pretty good handle on what they're saying to one another. Another reason is because Redwing Blackbirds are hands down the most vocally interesting birds in North America. There is a lot going on when Redwing Blackbirds start talking to one another. Now, when a male and female Redwing Blackbird are paired, they duet. They each have a different song that we heard a couple minutes ago. And when they duet in a particular way. The male sings, and he's got this song that's probably familiar to many people, Konkari. Male Redwing Blackbirds sing this Konkari song. And when they're duetting, the female starts her song halfway through his song. So he starts it, they overlap for a little bit in the middle, and then she finishes it out. Her song sounds very different from his. Hers sounds like this, cheer. Because those two songs sound so different, and because they start about half a second apart, you have probably heard this duet 1,000 times in the marsh, and you haven't realized it. When the male and female Redwing Blackbird are duetting, they may or may not be close together. They might be sitting near each other, or they might be 5 feet apart, or they might be 50 feet apart. The female might be down in the reeds near the nest where she's out of sight. The male might be up on a perch. And yet, if you are in the marsh and you hear the male and the female duet with each other, and there's this consistent half-second offset between their songs, with the songs slightly overlapping, you know you were listening to a mated pair. And this, if you're doing breeding bird survey work or breeding bird atlas work, this can actually be very, very useful for you to establish a breeding code for these birds. This is what it sounds like. That's the male starting and the female finishing it off. And that's the male and the female saying to one another, I love you. It is a pair bonding exercise when they duet. They don't duet every time they sing. Sometimes the male sings without the female. Sometimes the female sings without the male. But when they duet, that's them telling each other, I love you. However, when they duet, they're not just talking to one another. They're also talking to all the other Redwing Blackbirds in the marsh. And they're saying, I'm taken. Or more specifically, they're saying, my mate is taken. Male Redwing Blackbirds will defend their female against other males, and female Redwing Blackbirds will defend her male against other females using those respective songs. When they duet, they are letting the world know that this territory is occupied by a mated pair, and there's no room for anybody else on this territory. Now, male Redwing Blackbirds actually have two different kinds of songs that are very different. The most common one is the one we already heard, that Concaree song, but they have a song that's much less common that we call the flight song because it's only given in flight. And we don't have an entirely perfect understanding of what the flight song means, but here's our best guess. The flight song you might have heard before and not recognized it as a song because it just sounds like a long string of call notes, which is basically what it is. But every individual male has his own unique flight song that is the same notes in the same order every time. And it's usually some combination of different call notes, but usually there's 2 or 3 of those seer whistles in the middle of the flight song. Now, the males tend to make this flight song when they are leaving their territory, when they're flying away from their territory. And our best guess about why they do it is that they might be signaling to their mate that they are leaving the territory and she has to hold down the fort for a while he's gone. However, they don't make it every time they leave the territory, and sometimes they make it when they are on their way back to the territory. So it's not entirely clear exactly what the flight song is all about. Now, the female Redwing Blackbird also has 2 different songs. One of them we heard before. It's the I love you / I'm taken song. But she also has a more aggressive song that she gives when she's defending her territory against another female. And you can hear that that one is harsher in sound, and it's more aggressive in meaning. And female Redwing Blackbirds can actually express a wide range of, if you will, emotional states by mixing and matching the notes of these 2 songs. So they can kind of toss in more of those harsh notes into their I love you / I'm taken song. And so they can kind of express a range of messages in between I love you and get out of my territory. Now, when we're talking about bird language, sometimes one sound can have many meanings. And this is not too surprising because human language works the exact same way. If you think about it, the English language has a number of words that mean different things but sound the same. And when we are speaking and we use one of those words, we figure out what somebody else means, which meaning should be attached to that word from context. Birds do the exact same thing. So for example, this little ruby-crowned kinglet, in the summertime, when he's up on his breeding territory, he has a long and wonderful song that he sings. But during the winter, ruby-crowned kinglets mostly only just make one sound. It's some version of chit or chit-it or chit-chit-chit-it that they give over and over. Most of the wintertime, that one call has to suffice for all the things that a ruby-crowned kinglet wants to say. So that call, for example, might serve sometimes just to keep a flock together, just to say, here I am, to be used as a position note. Sometimes that might be an alarm call, warning of danger, warning of a predator. And sometimes if the ruby-crowned kinglet discovers a screech owl or a saw-whet owl roosting, that call might need to recruit other birds to come help mob that predator and drive it away. The other birds around it are going to figure out which of these meanings the ruby-crowned kinglet has in mind from context, the same way that a human would. So that means they're going to observe the situation. They're going to figure out whether they can see a predator, whether they can see an owl. They're going to look at the ruby-crowned kinglet. They're going to figure out how agitated it seems. How fast is it calling, for example? Does it seem really upset? Is it hopping around a lot? Or is it kind of foraging more nonchalantly? Is his little red crest erected in excitement or not? Based on the combination of all of those factors, the birds can figure out more or less what the ruby-crowned kinglet means, even though it's using the same sound for different situations. Again, this isn't too crazy because this is basically the way that human language works. But if in bird language, one sound can sometimes have many meanings, it's also true that sometimes one meaning can have many sounds. And to illustrate this, we're going to look at the bird that, as far as we know, has the largest vocabulary of any bird on Earth. Now, that caveat, as far as we know, is a big one, because as I said earlier in the talk, we actually have studied only a few bird species really in depth. So there might be birds with larger vocabularies that we just haven't studied well yet. But of the birds that have been studied, the one with the largest vocabulary is a bird that isn't very common in, well, it's very rare in California. It doesn't normally occur in California, but it's very common in the eastern United States. It's pretty common here where I am in eastern Texas right now. And that's the brown thrasher. The brown thrasher is a relative of the mockingbird. And as you know, mockingbirds are well known for having large vocabularies. But the average repertoire size of a brown thrasher is 10 times larger than that of its relative, the mockingbird. A few years ago, a couple of decades ago, a researcher named Don Kruidsma and one of his grad students decided they wanted to figure out how many different song phrases one individual brown thrasher can sing. Now, the brown thrasher sings a song where he sings one phrase, and then it's about 1 second long, and then he pauses for about 1 second, and then he sings a different phrase, and then he pauses for a second, and then he sings a different phrase, and then he pauses for a second, and then he sings a different phrase, and then he pauses for a second. I'm going to play a short snippet of Brown Thrasher's song so that you can hear what this bird sounds like. Try to figure out when the bird starts to repeat himself. Now you just heard a brown thrasher singing for 40 seconds. And in that time, the bird never repeated itself. Every single song phrase was different from the ones before it. But if you were trying to figure that out and you had difficulty, then that would not be surprising. Because in order to figure out when the bird itself, you have to remember everything that it has said so far. And that becomes a mental challenge very, very quickly. So Donald Kreutzma and one of his grad students went out on the campus of the University of Massachusetts. In the early 80s, they found a singing brown thrasher and they recorded it for 118 straight minutes, nearly 2 hours. And then they took that recording back to the lab and they tried to figure out how many different song phrases that individual male knew. Because it was such a mathematically challenging task to actually count all of the song phrases, all of the unique song phrases, they had to use estimates. And their estimate was that that individual male brown thrasher sang between 2,000 and 2,500 different song phrases. Now, just to put that in perspective, your vocabulary as an adult speaker of English is probably on the order of 25,000 words. So here's a bird that has a vocabulary about 10% the size of yours, and its brain is the size of your fingernail. However, brown thrashers might be saving some brain space in remembering all 2,000 to 2,500 of the words in their language. Because as far as we can tell, every single word in brown thrasher language means the exact same thing. Every one of those phrases simply means, I'm a brown thrasher and I'm looking for someone to share my territory with. Which immediately raises the question, why do you need 2,000 different ways to say that? And the answer is, we have no idea. Science has not answered this question yet. Here's actually a fascinating question with big implications for evolutionary biology that we don't know the answer to, and it concerns a very common and widespread bird that sings in a lot of people's backyards all spring, all across the eastern United States. This is common. It's common for us to not understand the vocal communication of even common and widespread birds. It's common for there to be a lot of opportunities for people recording bird sounds in their own backyards to contribute to our knowledge of bird sounds. Now, the classic explanation for how a bird's repertoire could have gotten that large, how a bird's vocabulary could have gotten that large, is sexual selection, also known as female choice. The idea being that at some point in the evolutionary history of brown thrashers, females developed a taste for males who did not repeat themselves. And therefore, the males with the largest vocabularies were the ones who found mates and passed on their genes. And over time, the vocabularies grew larger and larger. The problem is, I don't think that can explain how the brown thrasher's vocabulary got this big. Because if you think about it, in order for the female brown thrasher to choose between the male who sings 2,200 different phrases and the one who sings 2,500 different phrases, she's going to have to listen to them both for hours, if not days, and remember every single thing that both of them said so that she knows when they start to repeat themselves. And we are pretty sure that female brown thrashers are not putting in that much effort. It doesn't seem reasonable that they would put in that much effort. So we don't actually know how the brown thrasher's vocabulary got so large or what maintains it at that huge size. Why do brown thrashers have a vocabulary that's 10 times larger than a mockingbird's? What are they doing with all of those words? We have no idea. We know that they remember and repeat at least some of those phrases exactly later, but it's possible that a number of their phrases are improvised on the spot and never repeated. We don't know. Nobody's ever figured that out. This is a great example of a bird that we see all the time in the Eastern United States, and yet we still don't understand. Now, I told you that sometimes in bird language, one sound can have many meanings, and we've just seen that sometimes one meaning can have many sounds. And sometimes it's complicated. And to discuss this, we're going to go back to our old friends, the Redwing Blackbirds. Only this time, instead of talking about songs, we're going to talk about calls. In addition to the songs, the Redwing Blackbirds give a whole bunch of different call notes. Whenever a male Redwing Blackbird is not otherwise engaged, whenever he's not, busy finding food or defending a territory or whatever, he's sitting up on a cattail stalk somewhere in the marsh and just giving call notes over and over again. Most of those call notes sound something like chuck, and others might sound like seer, these whistled sounds. We call these alert calls, and an individual male Redwing Blackbird knows about 12 to 20 different alert calls. That's his repertoire of 12 to 20 different alert calls. They might sound something like this. There are 10 different calls from a male Redwing Blackbird. That might be half of this particular male's vocabulary of 12 to 20 different alert calls. When he's sitting up on his cattail stalk in the marsh, he's going to pick one of those 12 to 20 different alert calls that he knows, and he's going to repeat it over and over again. And all the other males who are sitting up in the marsh, all of them in that same marsh share the same vocabulary of 12 to 20 different alert calls. So all the males in one marsh, they have the same vocabulary, the same selection of 12 to 20 different alert calls. But if you drive to another marsh 30 or 50 miles down the road, you will find that the males in that marsh share a vocabulary with each other that is different from the vocabulary in the first marsh. So the vocabulary changes geographically in this species, but within one marsh, all the males know the same calls. They will sit up on their stalks and they will pick one of the 12 to 20 calls that they all know, and they will repeat it over and over again, the same call, every male giving the exact same call all over the marsh. Researchers noticed that when danger would appear, the call would change. And this suggested a reason why Redwing Blackbirds have 12 to 20 different alert calls. Maybe those different calls stand for different kinds of predators. Or maybe the different calls communicate the direction from which the danger is coming. Or maybe they indicate how close that danger is, how threatening it is, the level of alarm. The researchers wanted to know more, so they got themselves a stuffed Cooper's hawk and they put it on a stick. And they got themselves a bed sheet and a really long string so that they could go out into the marsh with the stuffed Cooper's hawk on a stick. They could stick it in the mud, put the bed sheet over it, and then retreat 50 or 100 yards with that really long string connecting them to the bed sheet, so that after the male had calmed back down and resumed his perch, the researchers could pull that string, whip the bed sheet off, and from the perspective of the male Redwing Blackbird, it would be like a Cooper's hawk suddenly appeared right in front of him. And the researchers recorded the calls that the males were giving before and after that bed sheet came off to try to figure out what these different kinds of calls meant. So, for example, let's say all the males are giving this call. One male is giving this call, all the others are repeating it all around the marsh. The researchers pull that string and the calls change. The first male to see the hawk changes his call, and all the other males follow suit. So the researchers thought maybe that seer call might be what you could call the hawk call, right? Maybe it's the call that they all give when they see a Cooper's hawk. So they tried it again. Before the hawk shows up, all the males say, I'd be giving this call. The researchers pull the string, and the males switch to that one. They tried it again. Before the hawk shows up, maybe they're giving this call. They whip the bedsheet off, the hawk appears, and they switch to that one. As they did it over and over again, what they figured out was that it doesn't matter which call the Redwing Blackbirds switch to when the hawk appears. What matters is that they switch calls. In other words, any call given over and over again in Redwing Blackbird language means all clear. And any switch from one call to another means danger. It is the switch in calls that carries the message. And when I found out about this, it absolutely blew my mind, because this is so different from the way that human language works. We are used to thinking of all organisms communicating the way that we do and experiencing the world the way that we do. Here is a communication system in which the words are meaningless. The individual calls in this Redwing Blackbird language mean nothing at all. It is the relationship of those calls to the calls before and after them in time that actually means something. The syntax carries the meaning in Redwing Blackbird language. I love this example for a number of reasons. First of all, because you can go out to the marsh next time you're around Redwing Blackbirds and you can hear this yourselves and you can pay attention to this. And the other thing that I love about this is that it teaches us to remember that when we speak about the language of birds, we have to remember that it's not just one language. It's 10,000 different languages. Every species has found its own solution to the challenge of how to communicate with audio. And many of their solutions are very, very different from the solutions that our species has found. So it reminds us to stay humble and reminds us of what we don't know about nature. That brings us to the books that I wrote, the Peterson Field Guide to Bird Sounds. I hoped when I wrote these books that they would be a dictionary for the language of the birds so that you could look up what the birds are saying. However, of course, as I mentioned earlier, we don't actually know what a lot of the sounds mean. So over and over again on page after page, you will see that phrase repeated in my book, more study needed. I put in what we did know and used my best guesses and intuitions, but there's a lot that we don't know. So hopefully up to a point you can learn what each species is saying in these books. But another thing that I wanted the books to accomplish was to get us all talking about bird sounds in the same way. I wanted to introduce a standard vocabulary that people could use to describe what they hear. We already have a standard vocabulary to describe the way birds look. We agree on the names of the colors. We all agree on the names of the parts of the bird. We agree on the names of the visual patterns. For example, we agree on the difference between a spot and a stripe. There's no reason we can't do the same thing for sounds. It's just that we never have before. We've never sat down and agreed on what we're going to call this or what we're going to call that. I tried very hard to create a language in my books that allows us to talk about bird sounds in a consistent way without having to learn too many new words. I tried very hard to use the words that people already use and just define those words more specifically and precisely. I also created this guide so that you can compare similar sounding species. When you get onto a page of the field guide and look at the spectrogram, down at the lower right-hand corner of every spectrogram, there's a little page number in italics that leads you to the back of the book, where there is an index of other birds that sound like that one. So in the back of the book, there's an index and it has all the birds grouped by similarity of song. So if you hear something and you're like, you know, it sounds like a Redwing Blackbird, but it might be different, you can go to Redwing Blackbird in the book and look up what else might sound like that. And that narrows it down from, 700 different species in the United States to 7 or 8 that you can then look up. And because of that, it allows you to look up a sound you don't know. The inside back cover of the book, the inside back 2 pages, have this quick index. They ask you the question, what did you hear? And this left-hand column is all of the single notes. The second column is the same note repeated over and over again, and then all the more complicated patterns are on the right-hand page. And as you can see, you can decide what you heard and then look through this little list for which of those descriptions matches what you heard best. And then that will lead you to a group of pages where you'll find lists of birds that sing with similar sounds. Nowadays, we can do something really cool. If you have a smartphone, you can actually create spectrograms of bird sounds in the field using a free app. And there are a number of free apps that work for this. The one that I like best is called Sleuth. And Sleuth has been made available free of charge. And it works on both iPhone and Android. And if you install it, you can actually create real life scrolling spectrograms of everything your phone is hearing at that exact moment. So you can turn it on and hold your phone up to a singing bird, and the bird's song will appear visually. on your phone's screen right as the bird is singing. This allows you to actually take a picture of a bird sound. You can also record the bird sound at the same time, and then you can have it on your phone. You can upload it to eBird or Xenocanto later if you want to do that. You can come back and look at the spectrogram anytime later. And if you're looking at the spectrogram and you have the picture of the sound, then you can actually go to my field guide and open it up and match a picture to a picture. And that is the way that field guides have always worked. It turns audio identification into a visual task, which for many of us makes it a lot easier. I will note that the goal of Song Sleuth, the function that it is supposed to achieve, is it's supposed to automatically identify the bird for you. It's not great at that. It's getting better, and over the next few years, probably this technology will continue to improve. But as of right now, Song Sleuth is not great at identifying the birds that it has recorded. So I don't use it for that. Whenever it prompts me to identify what I've just recorded, I just hit cancel. I really like using it for the recording and for the spectrograms in the field. I should also mention that there is a website that accompanies my book. If you go to petersonbirdsounds.com, that will redirect you to a page that is hosted by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, where you can listen to over 7,500 different bird sounds from North America, including all the ones that are illustrated in the book. And this is, if I do say so myself, the largest and best curated, I should say the most complete and best curated collection of bird sounds ever put together for North American birds. No purchase of the book is necessary. Anybody can go and listen to those bird sounds whenever you want, but they do not download. You have to stream them, which means that you do have to have an internet connection or a data connection in order to use the site. This is what it looks like if you go there, and underneath the picture of the books there, you can enter the species name. And if you look up a species, you will see all the different sounds that that species makes. You can click on any one of them and it'll pop up this little box, and you can actually watch the song scroll on your screen as you hear the sounds. It's a great way to learn what the sounds look like and learn how to read spectrograms, is to listen to the sound and then watch the sound being visualized at the exact same time. So that brings us to the end of what I wanted to share with you tonight. And we have a few minutes at the end here where I would be happy to answer any questions that you might have. And I'm not quite sure how the organizers here want to do that. I understand that we have both a Q&A tab on the screen here and also a chat. So how shall we proceed?
Well, thank you, Nathan. This is great. Yeah, we can read the questions to you. Shoshona will probably be queuing them up, but I might also, since the panelists who seem to be on here have any questions, they can also just verbalize them. So one question is there a way to play the graphic representation of calls we saw in the introduction? And I think you just went over that. Next would be next nearest rivals to brown thrashers. Are there any here? Anything on the West Coast?
The next nearest rivals in terms of large vocabulary?
Yes.
So probably the next one would be the northern mockingbird, which of course is familiar to people in California. The northern mockingbird, individual northern mockingbirds might know at least around 250 song phrases. And northern mockingbirds are one of the few species that we know can continue to learn new sounds throughout their lives. Most birds can't do that. Most birds are stuck with whatever they learned in their first year of life. and they can't learn new sounds after that. But mockingbirds can continue to learn new sounds throughout their lives. I'd also like to give a shout out to the Western marsh wren, because individual males can know up to 150 different song types, which is many more than Eastern marsh wren males can use. And so that's one of the reasons why, and the songs are slightly different too, which is one of the reasons why that some people think that the marsh wren should be split into two species, Eastern and Western.
And is that supported because of the sounds? Is that...
Yes, we need more research on the marsh wrens, but the songs are different. They're very different. They're difficult for the human ear to distinguish, but on the spectrogram, you can tell them apart. If you're really good with your ear, you can tell them apart. If you slow them down, they become quite different, which is more like how the birds hear them. And apparently these two different populations of marsh wrens, where they meet in the Great Plains, they usually don't interbreed. They might breed in the same marsh without mixing very often or hybridizing very often, because their different songs are keeping them apart most of the time.
Great. Question is, if the brown thrasher never repeats, is it remembering or composing on the fly?
So we don't actually know. We know that brown thrashers are remembering and memorizing at least some of their phrases, and you might hear the same exact phrase come back 5 minutes later, or an hour later, or 2 days later. So we know that at least part of their vocabulary is memorized. Some of it might be improvised. That would be, as far as I know, unique among birds. We don't have any good examples of adult birds that constantly improvise, but maybe a brown thrasher does that. We don't know.
Are you familiar with raven vocalizations? I guess. Where do they raven?
I am familiar with raven vocalizations. I need say no more. Question answered, right? What can I say about raven vocalizations? Ravens and crows are some of our most intelligent birds. They are communicating an enormous amount of information to each other verbally, or out loud, and we don't know much about their communication at all. Most of their sounds sound the same to our ear, some version of caw or croak, and there is a lot of information being transmitted. We know that individual ravens in a flock know each other. They know who's who in that flock. They can tell each other apart by sight and by sound. And we know that they can actually tell each other a lot of information about, like, for example, what humans look like and which humans are nice and which humans are mean. We have no idea how that information is being transmitted. There's a ton to learn about crows and ravens.
Okay. There's a comment made that dipper songs never repeats.
That which ones? The
dipper?
Dipper sounds, yes. The dippers do in fact repeat themselves. You have to listen for a while to figure out what a dipper's song repertoire is. I spent some time color coding.
Nathan, you froze. Move around, please.
Nathan, it might be helpful to turn off the video and then turn it back on.
Okay, well, guess you didn't want to tell us about dippers.
I bet he'll be back in just a second.
I bet he will be.
Meanwhile, if anybody is here from a location they haven't put in the chat yet, we're having fun putting those on a map. So if you haven't said where you're from yet, you're welcome to put it in there. We'll add you to the map. Nebraska, wonderful. I can just put the whole state, or if you want to say the town, I can plop it on there.
Nathan, we have you back.
Good. Good. Sorry about that. I guess my internet conked out on me for a minute.
The wind turbines aren't freezing over there now yet, are they?
Hope not.
Well, I got some more questions in the meanwhile.
Yeah.
Can stellar jays learn new sounds since they do copy other bird sounds?
They can certainly learn new sounds at some point in their life because, as you said, they do imitate other bird sounds when they're doing their quiet, complex songs. I don't know if Stellar's jays can learn new sounds as adults. Most birds, as I mentioned earlier, can only learn new sounds when they are less than 1 year old. But some birds can continue learning new sounds throughout their lives. I don't know if we know the answer to that for Stellar's jays. I'm guessing we don't know the answer.
Fair enough. And then question, which North American songbird has the greatest number of dialects? And here, white-crowned sparrows come to mind.
So if you're talking about dialects, meaning regional variations, yes, you could, it depends on what you count as a dialect, right? If you're defining a dialect as a shared group of songs that are shared by a neighborhood of males that sing, close to one another, or birds, not necessarily males, that sing close to one another, then yes, white-crowned sparrow comes to my mind as well, because white-crowned sparrow dialects tend to be fairly small and the bird has a very wide range. So there are probably thousands of different white-crowned sparrow dialects across the North American continent. But some birds can do that one better. First of all, because white-crowned sparrows only sing a single song, and there are many birds that sing many more songs. And so you have not only geographic variation, but individual variation. But even among birds that only sing a single song, as far as we know, common yellowthroats, every single male sings a unique song. So every individual male has his own dialect, and then his neighbor sings something slightly different, and then the next neighbor down sings something slightly different. So there are as many common yellowthroat dialects as there are common yellowthroats. And there are a few other birds that may be similar as well, including possibly sedge wrens and a few others.
Okay. When a young bird first moves away from its parents' territory and settles in a new area, does the song it initially learned become modified by new neighbors of the same species?
Now, hold on, that question went a little bit differently than I expected it to go. Can you repeat it real quick?
Sure. When a young bird first moves away from its parents' territory and settles in a new area, does the song it initially learned become modified by new neighbors of the same species?
Okay, so here's the thing. When a bird is raised by its parents, it doesn't necessarily learn its parents' songs. In fact, it's raised by its parents and it leaves the nest, and it generally leaves its parents' company in most songbirds by early in the fall, and it's out on its own and it doesn't yet know how to sing. And it is practicing singing all through the winter. And this is what we call subsong. And this is one of the reasons why in the wintertime or in early spring, you might hear birds starting to sing, but they don't sound quite right. They don't sound like they've got it down yet. A lot of times those are young birds and they sound that way because they don't have it down yet. And they're working to learn their own species song and practice it. Usually what happens, or at least in many species what happens, is that those birds don't fully learn their species song until they get all the way to their first spring territory, the summer after they're born. And then they learn songs from their neighbors on surrounding territories, instead of learning the songs that their parents sang. So if they disperse, 10 kilometers from where they were born, and there's a different dialect over there, that's the one they're going to end up singing their whole lives, is the one where they landed on their first spring territory, instead of the one that their parents taught them. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think it does. Fascinating. Question, if you want to get a better mic for recording, I imagine for your cell phone, what would you recommend?
So if you're going to use your cell phone to record bird sounds, I don't necessarily recommend getting a mic at all for that. If you're going to, I have a friend who tested out a bunch of those cell phone accessory mics and found that they do raise the quality slightly, but not by a lot. And the thing is that they're an extra piece to carry, and an extra piece that you have to then put onto the cell phone before you record. You can't have it in your pocket with the mic attached, So it was just easier for him to just have the cell phone and just whip the cell phone out and just make the recording with the cell phone. And most of you will find that. If you decide that you want to make better recordings than you can make with the cell phone, then you should look into buying a dedicated microphone, a dedicated recorder to go with it. And that's a little bit more expensive, but there are various options at various price ranges. I can share a link to a page with more information from the Macaulay Library if you want to look at that. And then we can, you can kind of decide what works best for you. What I would say is that from my perspective, I would much rather that you actually got a recording than that you got a good recording. I would rather that, I would say a bad recording is much, much better than no recording at all for those of us who are studying bird sounds. So don't let it stop you if you just have a phone. But if you want something better than that, you're probably going to have to buy a dedicated rig that is different from your phone.
Fair enough. Good answer. So a couple of questions about, could you finish telling us about the dippers before you froze for a while? So the color markings you were talking about, what you learned about that.
So sorry, I didn't know where I froze in that explanation. Before I get to that, let me just, before I forget here, I'm going to put in the chat the link to the page on the Macaulay Library website that I was just talking about, where if you're interested in learning more about audio recording gear, you can click on that link right there. When it comes to dippers, the song of a dipper is long and complicated and melodic, and it sounds like a Thrasher song or something like that. But in fact, if you actually compare dipper songs, like the songs that one individual dipper sings over time, you will find that dipper has actually memorized a long string of phrases, and it's always the same notes in the same order. Now, he actually has memorized probably 4 or 5 different, at least 4 or 5 different strings of notes. But every time, like if it's song A, then it might go in a particular order with particular notes. And the next time he sings song A, it's the same notes in the same order. And then he might know song B and C and D, and he might switch between those 4 songs. And each one of them has, a minute and a half of different lyrics, as it were. But it's always the same lyrics when he sings the same song. Does that make sense?
Makes sense to me. We'll see if the questions keep coming, but yeah. Okay, thank you. And it is 8 o'clock. I don't know if you're still available to answer a few more questions.
I can answer a few more questions. questions. It's 10 o'clock where I am, so I'm getting a little tired,
Sure.
but I can go for a couple more minutes.
Okay, the difference between a sonogram and a spectrograph.
A sonogram and a spectrogram. So sonogram, you may be familiar with the term sonogram from the old Golden Guide and from the 1960s and 70s and 80s. Sonogram is spelled with a capital S, and it is a trademark, in fact, of the K Elemetrics Corporation. There used to be only one machine that was marketed by this one company that could actually create audio spectrograms of bird sounds. And that was the case for over 30 years. There was only one company making this one machine. And so all spectrograms were sonograms in those days. Nowadays, we make them on our computer, and we have all sorts of different ways to make them. And so we usually use the word spectrogram now because it's not a registered trademark.
Okay, very clear. So a couple of questions about Eastern and Western forms of warbling vireo and Eastern and Western brown creepers. And are they potential candidates based on songs?
For the warbling vireos, I would say the answer is definitely yes. They are at least potential candidates for a split based on songs and other things. I guess there was a recent study done that might have come out recently or might be coming out shortly about Eastern and Western warbling vireos. So maybe we'll know more about that soon. Some friends and I got out last summer to answer the question of where the ranges of Western and Eastern warbling vireos meet in Eastern Wyoming. And it turns out that the Black Hills of South Dakota have Western warbling vireos up in the pine forest, but then all around the Black Hills on all sides in the lowlands.
And you froze again, Nathan.
Just right there, oh, I'm sorry.
No, you just came back.
What was the last thing you heard me say?
Wyoming.
So up in the Black Hills of South Dakota, Western warbling vireos breed up in the pines there. And then all around them on all sides in the lowlands, there are Eastern warbling vireos breeding, which right there, that island of Western warbling vireos and a sea of Eastern warbling vireos suggests that maybe they are two species. But hopefully we'll know more about that. When it comes to brown creepers, there are actually, more than just two, groups or dialects. You might have to think about the Pacific ones and the Boreal ones and the Rocky Mountain ones, and maybe the Mexican ones are a different kind or a different dialect kind of group. And I know that that's been another split that people are interested in. That's one I know less about. So I'm gonna not say anything more about that because I don't know much about the differences in those groups myself.
Okay, well, let me end with this question. What are you excited about doing next in your research or where you're going or anything? What's on your agenda once things open up again?
Well, that's a good question. I don't really have a current bird sound project so much right now. I'm excited about continuing to make recordings and continuing to go to places that a lot of people don't have recordings from and uploading those. I'm trying to get a little bit more into taking videos of birds and pairing that with sound as well. But yeah, I spent 16 years writing the Peterson Field Guide to Bird Sounds, the 2 volumes. And I'm very happy with those books and I'm very proud of them. And I'm glad they're done. And I'm kind of done with big bird sound recording projects of that type for now.
All right, great answer. So, well, thank you very much. I know that our 81 attendees, that you'd have a great loud applause for this talk. A lot of fascinating things you shared with us, and a lot of thanks a lot. Great talk and awesome presentation. So it was very well appreciated. We just thank you very much for sharing this with Godwood Days.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a great privilege.
Thanks, Nathan.
And just to say that tomorrow we start at 9 o'clock with a look at with Tony Kurz on amphibians. Thank you.
In Delmark County.
Okay, we'll end this session. Have a good sleep. Thank you.
Good night.